You know, sometimes life throws you a curveball, and other times it throws you a whole damn planet. That's what it felt like when I finally understood why my parents had raised me not as their child, but as their live-in servant, a shadow barely acknowledged, until one fateful day. It all unraveled at a wedding of all places when the bride's father, a man I'd never seen before, took one look at me and everything changed. He saw my face, and suddenly my entire existence was called into question. Was I wrong for the choices I made after that, for demanding the truth and reclaiming what was stolen? Tell me, honestly, if you would have done the same thing in my shoes. I guess to truly understand the sheer magnitude of what happened, we have to go back to the very beginning, to my earliest memories, which are not of lullabies or bedtime stories, but of chores. Always chores. From the moment I could walk, it felt like my hands were always busy, cleaning, carrying, cooking, scrubbing. My parents, Sarah and Richard, were not outwardly cruel in a physical sense. There were no beatings, no overt shouting, but the neglect, the emotional void, was a constant, suffocating presence. My older siblings, Mark and Lisa, were equally complicit. They were a few years older than me, and from their perspective, I was just there, an extra pair of hands, a convenient scapegoat, someone to boss around. They had their toys, their expensive clothes, their private tutors, and later, their cars and university funds. I had a small, dusty room in the attic, hand-me-down clothes that were always too big or too small, and a never-ending list of duties. I cooked their meals, cleaned their rooms, did their laundry, ironed their clothes for school, and even polished Mark's football trophies. I was never allowed to eat at the dinner table with them. My plate would be set in the kitchen, usually with leftovers, long after they had finished their lavish family meals, filled with laughter and conversation I wasn't privy to. They'd talk about their day, their friends, their dreams, and I'd be in the background, a ghost in my own home, clearing the table, washing the dishes, hearing snippets of a life that felt impossibly far from my own. I remember once vividly, I must have been around 8 years old, Lisa had a birthday party. The house was filled with balloons, streamers, and the joyous shrieks of children. I was in the kitchen, baking her elaborate cake, a multi-layered, pastel-colored creation that she had specifically requested. I remember looking at the intricate frosting, the little edible pearls, and a tiny, desperate hope flickered within me that maybe, just maybe, I'd be allowed a small slice to feel like part of the celebration. When it was time to cut the cake, I was called to serve it, carefully placing slices on fancy plates for all the guests. Lisa, beaming, blew out her candles. When everyone had their piece, there was no slice left for me, not even a crumb. Sarah, my mother, simply told me to clean up the mess. That was my life. I learned early on not to ask questions, not to expect affection, not to dream of a different existence. This was my lot, I thought. Some people were born to be served, and others, like me, were born to serve. School was a brief respite, though even there my parents made it clear I was not to excel, not to draw attention. "Just pass," Sarah would say, her voice devoid of any warmth. "We don't need you causing trouble or making extra work for us." I rarely had proper school supplies. My books were always old, tattered ones passed down from Mark or Lisa. I never participated in extracurricular activities, as there was always a mountain of chores waiting for me at home. Despite the lack of encouragement, I found solace in learning. Books became my secret escape, a window into worlds where children were loved, nurtured, and celebrated. I devoured every book I could get my hands on, often reading late into the night by the dim light of a small lamp, knowing I'd pay for it with exhaustion the next day. But the knowledge, the stories, were worth it. I excelled in secret, scoring high on tests, hiding my report cards, fearing that good grades would only bring more scrutiny or, worse, make them think I was getting ideas above my station. They certainly weren't paying for me to go to college. That was a privilege reserved for Mark and Lisa, who both went to prestigious universities, funded without a second thought. My future, I was told, was to continue managing the household, or perhaps find a menial job nearby once I turned 18, just enough to cover my own keep. The thought of leaving, of striking out on my own, was terrifying but also exhilarating. It was the only dream I allowed myself to entertain. I imagined a small apartment, a job where I was treated with respect, and the freedom to choose my own path. Years passed, marked by the monotonous rhythm of my servitude. Mark and Lisa grew up, went off to college, and eventually started their own lives, though they'd often return home for holidays, bringing their demanding habits and expectations right back with them. "Can you iron my shirt, my name?" Mark would casually ask, even as he stood in front of the ironing board, perfectly capable of doing it himself. "I need my favorite tea exactly how I like it," Lisa would announce, knowing I was already halfway through dinner preparations. I was their unpaid housekeeper, personal assistant, and chef. My parents seemed content with this arrangement. They rarely spoke to me beyond giving instructions or reprimands. There was never a "good morning," or "how was your day?" or "are you feeling well?" I was a utility, not a person. My 18th birthday came and went without a single acknowledgement. No cake, no gifts, not even a card. I spent the day like any other, cleaning the house, cooking dinner, and doing laundry. It was a stark reminder of my place in their world. But deep down, something had begun to shift. The quiet resentment had been brewing for years, simmering beneath the surface, and now, as an adult, it was starting to boil. I was legally an adult, yet I was still trapped, still serving. I started to save small amounts of money, coins I found on the street, or the occasional small tip from a grocery delivery man, dreaming of the day I could finally escape. I was planning meticulously for my freedom. The wedding was for Lisa, my sister. She was marrying into a very wealthy, prominent family, and Sarah and Richard were absolutely beside themselves with excitement. This was their crowning achievement, a testament to their social climbing, and they spared no expense. The wedding was going to be an extravagant affair at a grand estate, filled with influential guests. For me, it meant weeks of intense preparation. I was tasked with helping Sarah coordinate everything. From managing caterers and florists to addressing hundreds of invitations, polishing every piece of silver in the house, and ensuring Lisa's extensive bridal trousseau was immaculate. My hands ached, my feet throbbed, and my head spun with endless lists and demands. "Make sure the lace on Lisa's veil is perfectly pressed, not a single wrinkle," Sarah commanded, as if her life depended on it. "And you'll be in charge of making sure all the gifts are securely stored after the reception, do you understand?" On the day of the wedding, I was a whirlwind of activity. I helped Lisa get dressed, adjusting her elaborate gown, pinning her hair, fetching her shoes. She looked stunning, a vision in white, and as I saw her reflected in the mirror, smiling radiantly, a pang of something akin to bitterness, but also resignation, struck me. This was her moment, her future, and I was just the anonymous handmaid helping her into it. I was dressed in a simple, dark-colored dress, chosen by Sarah, that was meant to blend into the background. I wasn't allowed to sit with the family, of course. My instructions were clear: stay in the background, assist where needed, and be prepared for anything. During the ceremony, I stood at the back of the reception hall, near the kitchens, keeping an eye on things, making sure everything was running smoothly. The hall was breathtaking, adorned with flowers, twinkling lights, and the soft murmur of hundreds of elegant guests. The bride and groom exchanged vows. There was applause, tears, and then the celebrations began. As the reception started, I moved between the kitchen and the main hall, helping the catering staff, replenishing drinks, and subtly tidying up. It was during one of these trips, carrying a tray of empty champagne glasses, that it happened. I was making my way through a small cluster of guests near the grand entrance, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible, when a man, a distinguished-looking gentleman with kind eyes and a shock of silver hair, turned and caught my gaze. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and there was an aura of quiet authority about him. He was the bride's father, Mr. Harrison. I recognized him from the photos Lisa had shown Sarah. He paused, his smile fading slightly, replaced by an expression of utter bewilderment, then a dawning recognition that slowly turned to shock. His eyes widened, fixing on my face, studying every feature as if he was trying to solve a complex puzzle. I felt a prickle of unease. Had I spilled something? Was my dress not perfectly arranged? I tried to avert my gaze, to continue on my way, but he took a step towards me. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep, a little unsteady. "Do I know you?" I shook my head politely. "I don't think so, sir. I'm just helping with the arrangements." My voice was quiet, accustomed to being unheard. He didn't seem to hear my words. He just kept staring, his eyes tracing the contours of my face, my hair, my very essence. It was an intense, unnerving scrutiny, unlike anything I had ever experienced. People usually looked through me, not at me. You look incredibly familiar," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Almost impossible." Just then, Sarah, my mother, swept by, her face flushed with champagne and triumph. She noticed Mr. Harrison talking to me, and her eyes immediately narrowed with irritation. "What are you doing, my name?" she hissed under her breath, pulling me slightly by the arm, a sharp, possessive gesture. "You're supposed to be in the kitchen. Don't bother Mr. Harrison." She gave him a saccharine smile. "Oh, Mr. Harrison, forgive her. She's just one of the helpers, a bit overzealous, I'm afraid." Mr. Harrison, however, ignored Sarah's interruption. His gaze remained fixed on me, a deep frown creasing his brow. "One of the helpers," he repeated slowly, his voice now laced with a cold incredulity. "But she's the spitting image of," he trailed off, his eyes darting between my face and Sarah's. Sarah's face, usually so composed, paled visibly. A flicker of panic crossed her features, and she tightened her grip on my arm. "Yes, well, she's adopted," Sarah stammered, an explanation I had never heard before, not from her, not from Richard. "From a distant relative, a tragedy, you understand. We took her in. A charitable act, really." My heart lurched. Adopted. This was the first I was hearing of it. My whole life I had simply been theirs, a fact never questioned, never explained. Mr. Harrison's eyes, however, were not fooled. His gaze hardened. "Adopted." "That's quite a coincidence, then," he said, his voice losing its initial bewilderment and gaining an edge of steel. "Because she bears an uncanny resemblance to my late sister, Eliza. In fact, she looks exactly like Eliza did at that age." And just like that, the elegant, controlled atmosphere of the wedding reception fractured around me. Sarah's face went from pale to ashen. Richard, who had just walked up, drink in hand, paused, his smile dissolving as he took in the scene. The air crackled with unspoken tension, and suddenly all eyes, it felt like, were on us. I stood there, rooted to the spot, a sudden dizzying rush of adrenaline and shock coursing through me. Eliza, his sister. My mind reeled. It couldn't be. Could it? My entire life I had been told I was their child, albeit an unloved one. But this man, a stranger, was suggesting something far more sinister, far more profound. "This is highly inappropriate, Mr. Harrison," Sarah managed, her voice trembling slightly. "It's Lisa's wedding day. Please, let's not make a scene." But Mr. Harrison was not to be deterred. He took another step towards me, his gaze softening as he looked into my eyes, searching. "What's your full name, dear?" he asked me, ignoring Sarah entirely. "And how old are you?" I told him my name and my age. He nodded slowly, then turned to Sarah and Richard, his face now a mask of grim determination. "I think we need to have a very serious conversation immediately, somewhere private." Richard, usually so placid, actually gulped. He looked terrified. The wedding, the grand event, the culmination of their social aspirations was crumbling before their eyes, and I was, somehow, at the center of it. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice. Here I was at my sister's extravagant wedding, being confronted by a total stranger who claimed I looked exactly like his dead sister, while my parents stood there, sweating and denying everything. My entire identity, everything I thought I knew about myself, was thrown into question. I felt a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, fear, a flicker of hope, and a deep, burning anger. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have confronted your parents right there, demanding answers? Would you have walked away with the stranger, trusting his instinct? Or would you have tried to keep the peace for the sake of the wedding, only to address it later? What would you have done? Mr. Harrison did not wait for an invitation. He took charge. He gently but firmly guided me away from Sarah and Richard, towards a secluded study in the estate, indicating for them to follow. Sarah and Richard had no choice but to comply, their faces a mixture of fury and desperate fear. I walked beside Mr. Harrison, my mind a blank slate, overwhelmed by the suddenness of it all. Once inside the study, a quiet room filled with leather-bound books and a crackling fireplace, Mr. Harrison closed the door. He turned to me first, his expression gentle. "My dear, I apologize for this dramatic entrance, but I believe this is incredibly important. My sister, Eliza, disappeared almost 20 years ago along with her newborn baby girl. The police searched, we searched, but they were never found. We always held out hope, but as time passed, we presumed the worst." Eliza was a single mother. She had just given birth to her daughter. Her partner, a man she had recently broken up with, was violent and unstable. We always suspected he was involved, but there was no evidence. No body, nothing. He paused, his eyes still searching my face. You look so much like her. The same eyes, the same nose, the same hair color, and the age it fits perfectly with when Eliza's baby would have been born." He then turned his steely gaze on Sarah and Richard. Now I want a full explanation. Now. Sarah, ever the manipulator, tried to regain composure. Mr. Harrison, this is utterly absurd. This is our daughter, my name. We've raised her since she was a baby. There's no mystery here. Richard, however, was visibly cracking. He kept glancing at me, then at Mr. Harrison, his face a roadmap of guilt. Is that so? Mr. Harrison's voice was dangerously quiet. Because I have private investigators on retainer who would be very interested in this story. And I can assure you they are incredibly good at uncovering the truth. I will not hesitate to involve the police if you continue to lie. The threat was clear, and it hung heavy in the air. Richard finally broke. He looked at Sarah, a silent plea in his eyes, but she just glared at him, a warning. But Richard was past caring about Sarah's wrath. He was facing a far more formidable force. She's not ours, Richard stammered, his voice barely a whisper. We found her, or rather, Sarah did. Sarah let out a strangled gasp of outrage. Richard, no! Let him speak, Mr. Harrison commanded. Richard, now trembling, began to confess. His story, pieced together with Sarah's furious interjections and Mr. Harrison's pointed questions, painted a horrifying picture. It turned out that almost 20 years ago, Sarah had been struggling to conceive. They desperately wanted a child to solidify their social standing. But after years of failed attempts and expensive treatments, they were despairing. One day, Sarah had seen a notice in a small local paper, a plea from a young woman, Eliza, who had just given birth and was struggling to make ends meet, looking for help, possibly even to temporarily place her child with a stable family while she got back on her feet. Sarah, in a moment of twisted opportunism, saw her chance. She contacted Eliza, pretending to be a benevolent woman wanting to help. She met Eliza, saw the baby, me, and immediately, a plan formed in her warped mind. She didn't want to help Eliza, she wanted Eliza's baby. Eliza, vulnerable and desperate, had trusted Sarah. She had told Sarah about her abusive ex-partner and her fears for her and her baby's safety. Sarah had exploited every single one of Eliza's vulnerabilities. She had convinced Eliza to let her take the baby for a few weeks, promising to provide a safe haven, while Eliza dealt with her ex and tried to find a stable living situation. She gave Eliza a small amount of money, just enough to pacify her temporarily. But Sarah had no intention of ever returning me. She disappeared with me, cutting off all contact with Eliza, fabricating a new identity for me, and telling Richard that she had managed to adopt a baby through private channels. Richard, too eager for a child and too blinded by Sarah's persuasive charms, had gone along with it, never questioning the ethics or legality. He was a weak man, easily led. Over time, they simply forgot the details, pushing the dark truth into the recesses of their minds, and I became their daughter, a convenient servant to be exploited. As Richard's confession spilled out, the story became even more horrifying. Eliza, after realizing Sarah had vanished with her baby, had frantically tried to find me. She went to the police, she tried to contact Sarah, but Sarah had covered her tracks meticulously. Eliza, heartbroken and consumed by grief and guilt, had fallen into a deep depression. Her ex-partner, still a threat, had made her life a living hell. Eventually, unable to cope with the loss of her child and the constant danger, Eliza had taken her own life. Mr. Harrison's voice cracked as he recounted the painful story of his sister's disappearance and subsequent death, all while clutching a faded photograph from his wallet, a picture of a vibrant, beautiful young woman with my exact eyes, holding a tiny, swaddled baby. It was me. My heart ached, not just for Eliza, my birth mother, but for the life that had been stolen from me. The warmth of a mother's love, the protection of a family, the truth of my identity, all sacrificed for Sarah and Richard's selfish ambition and desire for a docile, unpaid worker. Sarah, by this point, was screaming denials, accusing Richard of fabricating stories, but her words were hollow, ringing with desperation. Richard, having unburdened himself, seemed to shrink into himself, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mr. Harrison, tears in his eyes, extended a hand to me. "You are my niece," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are Eliza's daughter, and you have a family who has been searching for you for nearly 20 years. Your grandparents, your other aunts and uncles, they never gave up hope." He pulled out another photo, this one a large, framed portrait. "This is your mother, Eliza, and this is her family, your family." I looked at the photograph, my vision blurred by tears. It was like looking into a mirror, seeing echoes of myself in the faces of strangers. yet strangers who felt more like family than the people who had raised me. My birth mother, Eliza, was beautiful, with a radiant smile and eyes that twinkled with kindness. It was a face filled with warmth, something I had never seen directed at me from Sarah. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My parents had not just taken me, they had essentially caused my birth mother's death. They had built their entire comfortable life on a foundation of lies and stolen happiness, mine and Eliza's. The anger, which had been a low simmer, now erupted into a raging inferno within me. "You," I whispered, my voice trembling, but imbued with a power I didn't know I possessed as I turned to Sarah and Richard. "You lied to me my entire life. You stole my mother, you stole my family, and you stole my childhood. You made me your servant, all for what? So you could pretend to be good people." Sarah flinched, but quickly regained her composure, her eyes narrowing with a familiar cruelty. "We gave you a home, food, clothes. What more could you possibly want, you ungrateful girl?" "A mother," I screamed, the words tearing from my throat, raw and painful. "A family that loved me, a life where I wasn't just a maid. You murdered her, you murdered my mother." My words, laced with years of suppressed pain and rage, echoed in the quiet study. Mr. Harrison stepped in, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. "That's enough," he said to Sarah and Richard, his voice cold and unwavering. "This is over. You will never have contact with my niece again. And this isn't the end of it. My lawyers will be in touch. What you did is not only morally reprehensible, but legally actionable. Kidnapping, fraud, emotional abuse, will explore every avenue. You will pay for what you've done." Richard, utterly defeated, could only nod, his face pale and clammy. Sarah, however, still had one last desperate attempt at defiance. "You can't prove anything. It's our word against yours. And who will believe a disgruntled servant over a respectable family like ours?" Mr. Harrison merely smiled, a chilling, humorless smile. "Oh, I think you'll find that my resources are significantly greater than yours, Sarah. And the truth, once it's out, has a way of convincing everyone, especially when it involves a missing child and a dead sister." He then turned his attention to me. "Are you ready to come home, my dear?" I didn't hesitate. I looked at Sarah and Richard one last time, their faces contorted in defeat and thinly veiled hatred, and felt nothing but a profound sense of closure. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I am." We walked out of that study, leaving Sarah and Richard to face the ruins of their carefully constructed lies. Lisa's wedding, the grand affair they had so meticulously planned, was effectively ruined. Word had already begun to spread among the guests. Whispers followed us as Mr. Harrison, with me by his side, made his way out of the reception. I saw Lisa, her face a mask of confusion, and Mark, his usual arrogance replaced by fear, trying to understand what was happening. I didn't spare them a second glance. They were part of the life I was leaving behind, a life of servitude and deceit. The aftermath was a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. Mr. Harrison, whose real name was David, immediately took me to his home, a warm and welcoming place filled with laughter and love, a stark contrast to the cold mansion I had just left. He introduced me to my grandparents, Eliza's parents, who embraced me with tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed with joy and sorrow. They showed me photographs of Eliza, told me stories about her, and I learned about the vibrant, artistic woman who was my mother. I learned I had her passion for reading, her quiet strength, her love for nature. It was like discovering a whole new person, a person I was deeply connected to, and a person I mourned with every fiber of my being. David immediately set his legal team on Sarah and Richard. The police were involved, and the investigation into Eliza's disappearance and my subsequent adoption was reopened. Sarah and Richard's carefully crafted facade crumbled under the weight of evidence and Richard's detailed confession. The legal battle was long and messy, but ultimately they were stripped of everything. They lost their home, their assets, their reputation, and faced criminal charges for kidnapping and fraud. Mark and Lisa, caught in the crossfire, were disgraced. Their comfortable lives, built on the foundations of their parents' lies, imploded. Their friends deserted them, their careers suffered, and they were left with the bitter reality of their parents' villainy and their own complicity in my mistreatment. They tried to reach out to me, to apologize, to plead for leniency for their parents, but I had nothing to say to them. There was no apology that could erase 2 decades of abuse and neglect. I, on the other hand, was finally free. I received therapy to process the trauma of my past, and with David's unwavering support, I started building a new life. My grandparents showered me with the love and affection I had been starved of, and I bonded deeply with David, my uncle, who became a true father figure. I pursued the education I had always secretly craved, enrolling in university, excelling in literature, just as my mother Eliza had done. I learned about my true heritage, the family history, and the love that should have been mine from the very beginning. It was a long road, filled with moments of intense grief for the life I never had, and for the mother I lost, but also immense gratitude for the family I found. I discovered a strength within myself I never knew existed, a resilience born from enduring so much, and a fierce determination to honor Eliza's memory by living a life full of purpose and joy. I never looked back. I never regretted the choices I made that day at the wedding. It was the day I stopped being a servant and started being myself. So that's my story. It's still hard to believe sometimes how one man seeing my face changed everything. It makes you wonder how many hidden truths are out there, waiting to be uncovered. If you were on my side, if you think I did the right thing, please like this video. Subscribe for more stories like this, and share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section below. I'll see you all in the next story.